This is episode 160 of Living Outside the Matrix.
Love forever.
Comprehensive goals.
Love forever.
Active minds, open doors.
Love forever.
You can see the signs. If you read between the lines.
Welcome back to part 2 of Dangerously False Ideas in this episode 160 of Living Outside the Matrix. In the last episode, I spoke about the proliferation of bad ideas that dominate Western culture. These false ideas, any false ideas in fact, cannot lead to success, but a false idea can only lead to failure and suffering, because there's some aspect of it that is not true, which means it's disconnected from reality. And we live in reality, we operate in reality, we must act in accordance with reality. This is why all our ideas must correlate with reality. My focus here today is to identify which of the fundamental ideas that shape our thinking, our values, our choices, and the way we live are false. We're not talking superficial ideas here, we're talking fundamental ideas. And I also want to explain why these ideas are false. Because it's these false ideas that are most dangerous. Ayn Rand taught me the importance of getting to the fundamentals in one's thinking. And this is how I know these ideas are false, because I make a deliberate policy of examining fundamentals, questioning assumptions, drilling right down to the beginning, as it were. Because this is the only method really that can get to the root cause of any problem. The science of fundamental ideas is called philosophy. And since this topic is totally out of fashion, it's not surprising that awareness of these dangerous, false, fundamental ideas is extremely low. And the reason it's out of fashion is because it has long been corrupted with false ideas, and mainstream philosophical truths, in inverted commas, are just like claims of false flag terrorism or any other false claims in the sphere of medicine, climatology, etc., etc. In the current context of 2022, human political freedom is fast being lost, and for those of us conscious enough to be aware of this much, it is crucial also to grasp that the battle for human freedom must be played out in the realm of ideas. It is only in this intellectual realm, the world of ideas, that we can argue for truth and argue for what is right. It is only through persuasion and by offering reasons that minds can be changed, if they can be changed at all. So if the battle for human freedom is ever to be won, it will be achieved by the use of reasoned argument with facts, evidence, proof, and logic. It's in the realm of the intellect that we must offer reasons and facts that expose the deliberate deception, the parasitism. And it simply can't be done by protests or marches or shouting or fighting, only by presenting ideas logically, rationally, and offering proof of their truth and validity. And by exposing false ideas and the contradictions that demonstrate their falsity. It's important to note that people are not controlled directly by others, at least not today, not by brute force. But they are controlled by the ideas, people are controlled by the ideas they are fooled into believing that are true. It's the ideas people hold as true that determine their values and their behaviour. Now, at the end of the last episode, I touched briefly on identifying the false first and why I'm doing that. I mentioned that it is easier to identify a false idea than to prove that an idea is true. All it takes is for one contradiction to be identified and an idea falls as false. An idea is false if it is contradicted by already known facts, or just one already known fact. And this necessarily includes, of course, the self-evident, right down at the everyday level. So using the example of germ theory, if you spend intimate time with someone who is very sick and you don't get sick, well then right there in your experience is something that contradicts the idea of germ theory. One thing I do want to share with you is that I've observed that most truth seekers will eagerly identify a false idea that's out there in the matrix, climate change, bogus climate change, for example. But they might be extremely unlikely and perhaps reluctant to notice one already embedded in their thinking. Once they own an idea to a significant degree, it seems they begin to identify with it and may become reluctant to question it. If an idea has been cherished for a long time, challenging it is even more likely to be met with inner resistance. But this is precisely where the root cause false ideas lurk, and they stay hidden there in our deepest premises, in our fundamental assumptions, in one's mental operating system, you could say. And it's because they can easily remain unquestioned by the masses that these are the most powerful and dangerous ideas. They are sown through propaganda, through advertising, through slogans, through songs, through cinema, through culture. And they get lodged there where they are never going to be questioned by the average person. The philosophical deceivers were the first and most fundamental deceivers. They did their work a long time ago. And a lot of the time these days, truth seekers are dealing with the leaves on the tree of a worldview without going to the trunk and the roots, because these are necessarily philosophical. And usually most people these days have already adopted, unwittingly, false philosophical ideas due to this deception that got there first. Let's remind ourselves that the more abstract an idea is, the more it is removed from the simple observation of concrete things before our eyes, the harder it is to unpack. But it still holds that observed contradictions in reality indicate something is wrong in the assumptions or the reasoning. So this means, as mentioned with the germ theory example, the self-evident, the obvious stuff in your daily experience. If an idea contradicts things that you already or know or accept as obvious, self-evidently true, then you can be sure that that idea is false. And the first idea I'm going to share with you is a great example of that, because it's held as true in spite of the obvious contradictions in our daily life. But we'll come on to that. One more thing is that the time lag between cause and effect can muddy the waters and make it harder to identify ideas as false. For example, you can eat a disastrously unhealthy diet for quite some time while you develop disease. So many years can pass until the symptoms become known. So this is the time lag between discovering that eating this diet, the idea of eating McDonald's and etc., is a bad idea. It's a false idea because it doesn't correlate with the reality of what your body needs. But the time lag masks the ability to see the false idea. So it's relatively, well, I hope it seems relatively obvious that it's imperative that we scrutinize or unpack ideas we hear and only act on ideas that we can be reasonably sure are true. This is the wider purpose of truth-seeking. This is why I do it. It's not only about knowing that the parasite class are deceiving and using populations. It's not only about knowing the scandemics and bogus climate change, although these things are important. It must also be about knowing how to live in every sense. How to eat, how to be healthy, how to remain fully functional in every respect over the course of your lifetime, as well as how to be productive, how to be wealthy, how to be free. We have to remember that freedom is like a prize that must be won. Yes, it is our right, but it can only be achieved by persuading all others, and especially governments, to respect that right and to leave us alone. So that said, let's continue with the dangerously false ideas. And the first one I want to deal with today is the idea that we create our own reality. This essentially means that consciousness is the creator. It means that reality is not an objective absolute. The idea that we create our own reality is a component of many people's worldview today. It's extremely popular. It's implicitly held as true, even in the face of overwhelming contradictory evidence everywhere, in every walk of life. Everything we do assumes and relies on the fact that reality is an objective absolute that we don't create. It's there and we have to deal with it. And yet, this idea gains traction. It's really quite remarkable. But we're going to dissect it. The biggest advocate of this idea was Plato, nearly 2,500 years ago, and more recently by the deceptive Immanuel Kant. I would hold that Plato got this idea back to front, not necessarily deliberately trying to mislead people, but simply because he was wrong. And yet Kant, when he advocated the idea, he was flying in the face of the Industrial Revolution, of the Enlightenment, and all of the amazing thinking that was riding on the back of the opposite of what he was claiming. So he very deliberately, I would say, advocated an idea that was easy to see is false. The idea about whether or not we create a reality or whether it's here first and then we arrive, this issue is right at the base of philosophy. And here is the key point. By implication, if one holds that consciousness creates reality, then reality cannot be an objective absolute. Implicitly, reality is not acknowledged as real, but malleable or shapeable by consciousness. And in this context, if your mind is implicitly on this idea that it's able to shape reality itself, what could truth mean? The idea of correlation with reality, because reality is then fluid. As soon as you're talking my truth or your truth, then truth has no meaning. Because for the concept of truth to have meaning, there must be only one truth, only one reality to correlate with. And that reality has to be what it is and not affected in any way by any consciousness. It has to be fixed, if effectively, or not fixed, but it has to be unchangeable by consciousness. Either yours or a divine creator or the collective's, any consciousness. As soon as we concede that reality is not a fixed absolute, truth is meaningless. And at that point, you can't argue or reason for anything. Might becomes right, and the strongest person, the nation with the strongest army wins. The biggest thug wins. The person holding the club wins. And reasoned discussion is a thing of the past, and that's why this idea must be corrected. The idea also has a corollary in epistemology, and that is that reality is unknowable in reason. If you hold the primacy of consciousness as a truth in your worldview, if you are your mental processes are operating on the assumption of that worldview that consciousness creates reality, the primacy of consciousness, how could you possibly know what is going to be created by others or by God if you believe in that? So that's reality cannot be knowable by definition if one imagines that it's continually being created by people or by a divine being, if you think that they exist. So reality becomes unknowable. You can't possibly know it. As soon as it's not that fixed absolute which you must discover through scientific method, through trial and error, through the use of reason. Secondly, according to this idea, the primacy of consciousness, reality isn't really to be found out there anyway, since out there, in quotes, is a creation of consciousness, the inner world. Then introspection becomes the obvious shortcut to truth, subjective truth. But subjective truth, your truth, and his truth, their truth, my truth, and everyone's truth, as I've said, simply destroys the concept of truth. So we can see here that the idea of creating your own reality, thinking that thought is the primacy of consciousness, this is often held as a result of confusion between the subjective and the objective. A simple example, two people in the same room, one feels hot and the other feels cold. So one of them says, the first says, well, my truth is that it's hot, and the other says, no, it's cold, therefore truth is subjective. No, we must recognize that there are things that we experience subjectively. And if one person's estimate of the temperature of a room is that it is higher than they would like, and they label it as hot, and another person's view of the temperature in the same room is that it is a little lower than they'd like, and they label it as cold, these two interpretations of the one fixed absolute reality does not indicate that reality is subjective. Everybody necessarily has things that are subjectively experienced. All of our emotional reactions, our subjective evaluations of when we're hungry, when we need to go to the bathroom. There are lots of things that are necessarily subjective. But we must remember that all of our subjective experiences exist within one objective reality. Imagine you're in a crowd of people and you zoom out and hover above them. You're looking down at hundreds of people. They all exist down there, and each one of them may be feeling tired or hungry or this or that or cold or hot, or maybe thinking these beliefs or those beliefs. May have all manner of subjective things going on for them, but there they all are. They're all down there in that crowd. They all exist. They're not creating anything outside of themselves. They're simply having their own personal experience of the one objective reality. We must also bear in mind with this dangerous false idea, as we introspect, that the primacy of consciousness can be used as a convenient psychological get-out clause, absolving the believer of the need to face facts and enabling him or her to live a make-believe world according to him or herself. My subjective experience, in quotes, becomes the false measure of truth. This is dangerous because it disconnects the individual from reality. So this escape clause, this convenient thing, is a very, very powerful attraction towards this idea. If you absorb this idea, if you adopt it as true, it lets you off the hook. So this is a big clue to the psychological appeal. But it's essentially mysticism applied to metaphysics. Metaphysics being the base subject of philosophy. What is reality? What is real? And mysticism, as we talked about in part 1, is the practice of believing in things without reasons. And so this is mysticism applied at the base of philosophy to metaphysics. It's a subjectivist metaphysics with this associated idea that you can't know reality, at least not in reason. And that leads us on to another false idea. The primacy of consciousness, this idea you create your own reality, is often held by people as a result of simply failing to think consistently and join all the dots in their own mind. It's a fallacy, it's a logical fallacy, and I like to think of it as the logical fallacy of cutting off the branch you're standing on. Which means if you think you're up a tree and you've got a chainsaw, imagine yourself, you wouldn't do it, which is why this is a good way of illustrating it, but imagine you walked out along that branch and then faced the tree trunk and bent down to say, no, this branch is wrong, this is dead, we can't have this, and then you proceed to chainsaw it off at the trunk. You're standing on it, you're clearly going to fall and suffer. And this is to illustrate that in everyday stuff we are dealing with the objective facts of reality. Language, for a start, is it totally objective? Every time you get up in the morning and you go to the bathroom or make a cup of coffee or deal with people, every single thing in your life you're dealing very self-evidently with objective reality. It doesn't move around, it doesn't change, it is what it is, and your consciousness can't affect it. When you're driving up the road, when you're driving to work or to the bank or to the shops, you must conform to the objective road in front of you. If it twists left, right, up, down, traffic lights, you must conform to that reality. It's objective, it's obvious, it's self-evident, which means directly available to consciousness. If you're trying to cross a busy street, imagine you're trying to cross a superhighway. Can your consciousness hold back the traffic? Of course it can't. Of course it can't. You would be absolutely insane if you were to walk out in front of a busy highway thinking that somehow your intuition or your higher self is going to tell you when to walk and when to stop. No one would do that. It's self-evidently would be madness. So, because it's so self-evident that reality is an objective absolute, and we all operate on that, to argue against it and to argue and say, oh, consciousness creates reality. Look, you can do this with your mind. If you do have the right mindset, you'll change what you experience. Again, this is another point of confusion. Your mindset and your attitude and the way you approach reality is extremely relevant to your experience of it, but it does not suggest for a moment that reality is not a fixed absolute. So the point here is consistency in our thinking. We have to bring the idea that reality is a fixed absolute, which means you're not creating it, into our thinking and let it merge with all of our thinking. We have to be consistent in our thinking. You see, if we're arguing for peace, freedom, justice, and all these sorts of things, if we're arguing for the proof of an idea, or if we're demanding proof of something, if we're demanding proof of why a particular policy is necessary, why should we wear masks, why should we get vaccinated, why should we live less because you tell me that there's a climate emergency? If we're asking these questions and demanding answers, we're standing on the branch of reality as an objective absolute. There is a reason out there parked in reality. So if we're asking these questions, we have to be consistent And remember that if we entertain the thought that we create our own reality in another part of our mind, we've fragmented our mind. We're arguing against ourselves. We are disintegrating our consciousness. And this is no good. We must stay integrated with a fully integrated mind and be consistent and remain able to argue for facts. We must not entertain ideas, this dangerously false idea that we create our own reality, without consciousness of the fact that if we hold that idea, we are cutting off the branch we're standing on. We are undermining ourselves, and we are arguing against our own capacity to reason, to demand facts, evidence, and proof for anything that the government might want to do against us. If any criminal comes and infringes on us, we want to say, no, this is wrong because of these reasons. So we have to make sure we stay on the side of reason. That's why this is such a dangerously false idea. This first idea today, that you create your own reality. You do not. Reality is what it is. It exists before you arrive, and your consciousness cannot affect it directly. Your attitude, your mindset, and your mind can discover reality and then transform it. The computer that you're probably listening to this on was made by transforming matter into something specific, into a creation of man. So we can create things, but not directly with our consciousness, without first finding out how reality works and obeying its laws, and then reforming matter to suit our purposes. So let's move on to idea number 2, and it's an associated idea that follows on from the primacy of consciousness, and it is that perception is projection. It's all in you, and you project it out onto your reality. This idea holds that you cannot perceive anything that is not you. This idea assumes, obviously, the previous one, that we create our own reality, but with a sinister twist. It puts all the blame or the responsibility for your circumstances, your predicament, onto you. Perception is projection, is the name of this idea. Now, this idea tends to be explained. It is said that this way. It is said that the idea means that you can learn by paying attention to all the people in your life, because they're all projections of some aspect of you. Well, I would say that you don't need to accept this idea in order to conclude that you can learn from all that happens in your life. You should be doing this anyway, all the time. But the perception is projection idea implicitly declares that you are responsible for everything in your world, including your slavery, your exploitation, your suffering. It's all your fault if you take this idea to its logical conclusion. Now, if I were a despotic tyrant who wanted my victims to take the blame for their own misery, for their own exploitation and suffering, this would be the perfect dogma to sell them. It's a perfect idea. If you are perceiving this suffering and injustice, if you are perceiving this theft and exploitation, this parasitism, then it is in you. It's your fault. You are creating it as a projection of your own deepest evil self. Once again, we can see mysticism applied to metaphysics. Because, in fact, reality exists and you need to deal with it. And if you are imprisoned or enslaved, or if circumstances happen to you, they are not necessarily your fault. Obviously, the context dictates. And once again, this is a subjectivist metaphysics. The third idea that I want to look at is again related. This associated idea is that quantum physics proves the primacy of consciousness. Quantum physics and the theories of Einstein and his associates, the double slit experiment and stuff, proves that consciousness creates reality. This is essentially the idea. Most people who cite the idea that we create our own reality immediately mention the double slit experiment. And by implication, of course, the Copenhagen interpretation of that experiment. Implicit is the acceptance of a trustworthy and sound body of knowledge upon which we can all confidently reason forward. It's a given. It's an assumption that is perceived as rock solid. Well, because the Copenhagen interpretation of the double slit experiment says this, a particle can be either a wave or, light can either be a particle or a wave, etc., etc. The interpretation flies in the face of the idea that reality is a fixed absolute. And this idea that I want to point out is that this interpretation, this experiment, and what the so-called scientists and interpreters were saying about it, and have done ever since, this is held up as a sacrosanct reason. It's considered proof. It's given as much weight as the self-evident right in front of your eyes. But is it safe to draw conclusions on this? The double slit experiment and its common interpretation to mean that the observer creates reality is considered unquestionable by many. An assumption on which you can base your own metaphysical convictions about the nature of reality. This in spite, once again, of the contradictory evidence in every moment of the day in your daily lives. Make a cup of coffee and see if you can make it cool down in 10 seconds with your consciousness. See if you can break the cup. See if you can mop up a mess with your mind or change things. I mean, there's nothing you can do to directly affect reality. The only way you can affect reality is by thinking, observing the facts and acting in accordance with them and initiating an appropriate cause to deliver an anticipated effect. This is the way that we rearrange matter to suit our purposes. We don't use consciousness. And once again, the evidence flies in our face, and yet people hold up the quantum physics, the double slit experiment, something you can't see, something you can't recreate at home, something that's abstract and conceptual and is ultimately meaningless, is given higher priority in terms of identifying what is real and what is not than what's really there in front of people. It's quite amazing how the contradictory evidence can be ignored. The idea that the Copenhagen interpretation of the double slit experiment shows proof of the primacy of consciousness is a favourite of subjectivists, the advocates of the primacy of consciousness. You know, they cite that allegedly electrons can be waves or particles depending on whether or not they're observed. It can therefore be concluded, they say, that the observer plays a role in the creation of reality. But as mentioned, when we consider the real world around us, this idea just hits a brick wall. It must be noted also that there are other interpretations of the double slit experiment, ones that factor in the ether, which Einstein and his associates were very keen to rubbish, and they kind of got rid of the idea, which was widely accepted in science until this time, of the ether as this the stuff, you know, out there in space. Even when there's no air, there's ether, and this was a widely held idea that the ether is real and that we needed to know more about it. And there are other interpretations of the double slit experiment that it can be argued, actually demonstrate the existence of the ether. But of course we don't hear about those, just like you don't hear about the fact that there's no evidence to support the existence of these small particles that allegedly cause disease. Just like you don't hear any of the contradictory evidence that undermines the idea that there's a climate catastrophe, or that, you know, the gas of life, carbon dioxide, is somehow going to destroy us all. It's for the same reasons that you don't hear these other interpretations of the double slit experiment. And therefore, my friends, if any of you out there do think that you create your own reality and the proof is the double slit experiment, I invite you to question your assumptions, check your premises. Another thing that the quantum physics idea, you know, Einstein and all those heroes of the intellect, the untouchables, right up there on the altar of brilliant thinking, allegedly. Another thing that they tell us is this sort of idea of spooky action at a distance, and things like entanglement, and that the universe is allegedly one unified field of pure potential that is brought into being by thought. This is simply appealing sounding words by mystics posing as scientists, and it's not actually based on any observable facts of reality that you can verify. It's all theory. It's all stuff that happens in a particle accelerator or the CERN place in Switzerland. It's nothing that you can actually verify. And yet, in the privacy of your own home, you can verify that your thoughts cannot directly affect the matter around you with which you deal. So it's worth questioning who we are listening to, guys. This is my point here. Question quantum physics. You know, it may be hard because of the relentless programming we've been subject to, but Einstein was just a guy that was put up to say stuff 100 years ago. He was bigged up massively, and his crazy theories, the theory of relativity and stuff, almost nobody in his time could understand it, and almost nobody today can. So we have to remember that he could easily be the Anthony Fauci of 100 years ago. We must remember to question assumptions, is the point. If we are rightly engaged in questioning what we're told as part of the process of discerning truth, if we're actively engaged in questioning the pandemic, the climate change, false flag terrorism, the fundamental assumptions of medical science and political science, then why would Einstein and all the mystical mathematicians of quantum theory, why would they be held above suspicion? Why would we consider their extraordinary claims that contradict our own common sense and direct experience of reality as true, without question? This would be a huge inconsistency, would it not? And the bottom line here, guys, is that, in fact, all alleged science needs to be questioned, particularly in the political context of global agendas of control and the social context of ubiquitous propaganda that has penetrated every level of Western culture for well over 100 years. In this context, we must question these so-called scientific conclusions that lend themselves nicely to the mainstream agenda for political control. They are prime candidates for questioning, and especially when the facts of reality available to us in our everyday lives right in front of us, especially when they are effectively overturned by these supposed truths coming from the scientists. Okay, let's move on. Idea number 4. You can just know. You can just know stuff without knowing how you know. Now, earlier on, we identified the corollary of the primacy of consciousness, that knowledge is not gained using reason to identify facts in reality. Because if reality is not an objective absolute, then you can't know it. So there's only one other way that you could possibly claim to know anything, and that's going to be by consulting your emotions, or this mystical intuition that, or your feeling, or channeling, or contact with your higher self. These become these fanciful and in fact nonsense, if you really think about it, guys. These nonsense claims have to be imported because reason has been disqualified. If reality is not an objective absolute, as the first idea would hold, the primacy of consciousness, we create our own reality, then you can't know in reason. But the associated with this idea is that you can just know. It's like you don't need reason. That's the point. You don't need it. Bypass it. Just go straight to your inner world, consult your intuition or your inner knowing, which amounts to your feelings. You don't have anything else. We have a rational faculty in our mind, and we have emotions, and we can feel things. And if we're dealing with facts of reality, if our values are rational, our feelings align with our thinking. But as soon as our thinking departs from reality, our feelings are certainly no guide to anything. It should be fairly obvious that feelings are not a guide to knowing reality, but many people overlook this. An example, for example, 3 people booked on a plane flying home from, I don't know, let's say somewhere in Europe, in Spain. One of them's got an urgent appointment in London. The flight's delayed. He's going to be feeling anxious, annoyed, tense, concerned about his meeting that he might miss. Whereas if the flight's delayed, some other young chap sitting next to him, or you know, another young chap at the airport, if the flight's delayed, would think, oh great, I get to spend some extra time with my lover. Fantastic. I'm going to be feeling good about that. And then there may be somebody on holiday, a third person that couldn't give any interest one way or another. So what, the plane's late. Emotions are not any means to knowing reality. And I go into this in other places on my website and in other podcasts, but it's really important to get. We have no other way of knowing other than using our rational faculty. Reason, evidence, proof, and logic. That's how we humans function. So this idea is an obvious form of mysticism, since reasons are irrelevant. The idea that you can just know divorces knowledge from thought, and therefore destroys any meaning in the concept of knowledge. Knowledge is an achievement. Real knowledge is an achievement that is striven for and worked for. You can't pass that test without doing the work. You can't go to your, to any exam, a really top important exam, and just think, do you know what, I'm just going to tune into my intuition and I'm going to write whatever comes to mind and I'll just know it. We all get that would be silly. It's a wishful thinking desire for effortless knowledge. It is a claim to knowledge without thinking, without reasoning, judging, or evaluating. Nice and easy. No effort. All you just do is feel and know. I hope you're getting the picture here that this absolutely cannot be true. It's nonsense. It's a faulty subjectivist epistemology in which one's emotions are used as tools of cognition. The way one feels is taken as guidance about what is real. And as we saw with mysticism in general in the previous part 1 to this podcast. The mind that believes it can just know has divorced itself from its only means of certainty, reasons. Therefore, anxiety and fear can only result when one has no reasons to justify one's values and or one's actions. Dangerous false idea number 5 is belief in a higher power to which you are subordinate. You are down here and there's a great big super being or a higher thing above you. And this is very, very widely held. Implicitly, people don't go around talking about it. Anyone who speaks of God, anyone who goes to church, of course, implicitly is right there. Most New Age thinkers implicitly think that God isn't the old man in the sky. They've changed the model of God. Now he's everyone. We're all one and we're connected, and there's always super energy. And we are subordinate to it. So the idea is that human beings, you and me, the individual, the unit of humanity, is subordinate to some big higher power. Now I refer to this as the dark con of man, a phrase that you might remember hearing in the Da Vinci Code and some of Dan Brown's writing. The dark con of man. It's the common denominator of arguably all religions and every exploitative doctrine that seeks to make the host look up to the parasite. So the host is you and me. We are being parasited on. It's our stuff that's being stolen. It's our efforts that's being harvested. And we're being encouraged to look up to the parasites, the royal family, the controllers, the farmers, the gods, the ruling kings and queens. And there is absolutely zero proof that this is real, nor rational argument for the existence of a supreme being. There's no proof for a creator or a super wise father figure in the sky. To acknowledge or to worship a higher power is to choose subservience, to choose to be subservient by your very nature. It's to deny your own power and consider your own self secondary by the natural order of things, even if precisely what you are allegedly secondary to isn't clear. What is God? Or even if it's loosely defined, the point is you are second. You're second in command. You're down and you must look up. To hold this idea is to self-limit the power and responsibility of your consciousness, and to limit the ambition of your consciousness towards knowledge or greatness. Let's remember that religion has always been a tribal substitute for an organized system of philosophy, a means to guide the lives of men in the absence of a rational and consistent set of principles. Religion has historically stood in place of philosophy in offering guidance on how to live, but men must grow up out of believing in ghosts and into identifying an objective reality and thus gaining knowledge. Men must rediscover philosophy, the science of fundamental ideas that affect human life, and live by a rational code. Men must live by a rational code of values based on knowledge. Subordination to a deity or some greater being is the ultimate duff steer, appropriate for slaves. Any aspiring tyrant or ruler would want their subjects to be predisposed to considering themselves subservient to a greater good or an alleged higher power beyond themselves. In contradiction to this, I would advocate that there is no higher power, there is no greater authority than the sovereign human consciousness. And that presupposes rational action. It doesn't mean that any old idiot is an authority. Of course it doesn't. But the thinking individual, the intellectual man, as a result of the acquisition of knowledge, knowing our reality, choosing our values, deciding what values to pursue, what goals to pursue, pursuing the purpose of our own happiness, we are the authority. We must author our own lives. It is our responsibility to take authorship of our own lives. And this false idea that there's a higher power that you have to grovel to just knocks you off the top. There's no way it undermines you. You're not capable. You're down there. Get down there and look up. I say no to that. The facts of reality do not support that idea. They contradict that idea. The last dangerously false idea we're going to look at is the idea that you can experience the real reality through altered states of consciousness. So again, this idea already presupposes another one. It presupposes that we really live somewhere else in another superior reality, and we effectively come here on a kind of a boot camp visit where we learn lessons and then we graduate back to spirit world or this other real reality beyond the 3D that we know. And this idea, this dangerously false idea, holds that the real reality is distorted with our five senses, but it is perceivable when we're in altered states of consciousness, such as ayahuasca or dimethyltryptamine, DMT, or any other hallucinogenics, magic mushrooms, LSD, the whole spectrum. But let's look at this. What can we be conscious of? We can be conscious of the real world outside of our heads with our five senses, and we can be conscious of the inner world inside our consciousness by introspection. That's all there is to be conscious of. And again, we have to acknowledge that this idea already rides on a false assumption that there's another reality somewhere else, another existence somewhere outside of what we can perceive exists. But let's also look at what altered means. Altered states of consciousness are apparently, according to this idea, the way of really connecting with what's real. But let's remember that the word altered, can mean anything. Altered to what? What does that mean? Just changed. It can mean anything, and therefore it means nothing. Altered from what you know, your waking consciousness, to what? A DMT experience? A crazy LSD trip? Where you're demonstrably not functional to proceed with your normal life. And let's also look at expanded. The word expanded, that's often used to describe these states of consciousness that you can reach. You alter your consciousness to reach expanded states. Expanded surely means more aware in some way. What else could it mean? Expanded consciousness must be more aware of stuff. But our conscious awareness can only be operating to its maximum potential when you're tuned into your sensory perception. In terms of your ears and your sense of smell, and there's only full awareness. If you were a hunter creeping through a forest, you would be in full awareness of your surroundings, fully tuned in. Your sensory perception would be maximized to 10 on the dial, if you like. But But your sensory awareness is limited. It's only your conceptual awareness that can be infinitely expanded with conceptually inferred knowledge. If we're talking about the South Pole, we're all talking conceptually. We're all imagining this cold place because none of us are there. It's not immediately perceivable. And it is only through our conceptual knowledge that we can really expand our awareness. When we think about the nature of the solar system, for example, naturally we can't directly perceive it, only in painstakingly small snatches taken every night through a telescope, etc., etc. It's not something we can just sit back in our chair and think, oh, look, there it is. And unless, of course, you subscribe to the Tychos, but that's another thing. It's conceptual knowledge that we can expand. If we remind ourselves that there's only one reality, and it's an objective absolute, as is demonstrated by all the facts that confront you from the time you get up in the morning to the time you go to bed, everything in your real life points to that. And also your faculty of reason is your only means to knowing it, and therefore being able to act successfully within it. And there's no other existence somewhere outside of what exists and is real. I mean, we really have to question that. And taking consciousness scrambling drugs, can that really help you, me, or anyone get in better contact with reality? It seems absurd to think so. Yes, you have a trip, an experience inside your scrambled consciousness, but why would anyone conclude that in this state you are somehow better in contact with what is real than you are when you are in a normal brain state, using your humanal faculty of reason in the process of conceptual thinking? Why would we conclude that when we're working normally and properly, grasping reality and going about our daily stuff, perhaps using computer programs, driving to the shops, building bridges, flying aeroplanes, using our normal brain state faculty, operating with reason on a conceptual level, why would we think that that is somehow there is something superior to that? Why would we think that if we scramble our brain on a drug trip into a state that is obviously renders us dysfunctional? I took a DMT experience under supervision, and I would not have been able to perform any of the normal duties of my life while I was on DMT, or any of the acid trips I did in my youth, or on any of the magic mushrooms that I've tried. I have never found that these means of producing a changed state of consciousness, they never brought me into a state of greater functionality. It was always non-functionality that they brought me to. So to conclude that any of my experiences of this scrambled brain state, where still obviously all the pool of knowledge in my subconscious is available to my mind in this trip, it can pull on any of my experiences in my life so far, and therefore create an illusion of generating meaning, as people consider dreams do. There's no actual reason to suspect that this would render me in better contact with what is real than when I'm actually firing on all cylinders, consciously speaking. So, yeah, this is the last idea, which is false. The idea that you can go and take some drugs, have some kind of experience that is a distortion of your normal brain state, and through that you contact the real reality, because of course we don't live in the real reality according to this false idea. I hope you can see the falseness. I hope I'm managing to paint the picture that this is quite obviously nonsense, but seriously held to be true by many people who would probably call themselves truth seekers. So these are the 6 dangerously false ideas that conclude this little presentation. There is more to say. The idea of altruism, the idea that it's bad to be selfish, the idea that emotions are guides to knowing things. These are all ideas that I've looked at elsewhere on my podcast and on the website, and deserve slightly more in-depth discussion than I'm doing today. But all of these 6 ideas grow out of false philosophical premises, i.e. ones that don't correlate with reality. These are really deep down in your thinking system, in your mental operating system. And whether incorrect by mistake or by design, whether they've been deliberately fed there or whether it's just a mistake, these ideas must be identified, recognized as false, and rejected for any human, you, me, everyone, to succeed at living and to truly thrive. In other words, if peace, freedom and abundance are ever to be achieved, most notably freedom at the moment, that's the one that's desperately under threat, we must get our mental houses in order and throw out the false ideas that can easily lead us to the wrong conclusions. I sincerely hope that I've provoked some thought, and that maybe you will be inspired to revise some of your premises, to ask yourself what you believe and whether it really is consistent with reality. So thank you very much for listening, and do visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. As usual, there's a whole lot more on there, particularly about exploring emotions and questioning altruism and things. And I do hope that you will join me again for another intellectually challenging episode of Living Outside the Matrix.